Welcome back to the Chelsweets kitchen. So while I've done a lot of in-depth tutorials in the past, I realized that shockingly, I've never done a tutorial showing just the basics on how to stack and frost a cake. So I have one on getting perfectly smooth sides on a cake, on doing a drip cake, but nothing on just the pure basics. So that's what I'm going to cover today. So to do this, I have 4 vanilla cake layers here. I've leveled them and I've made them in advance, so I've frozen them. I've wrapped them in some saran wrap to keep them fresh. If you want to learn more about how to make cake layers in advance, I have a blog post on that included in the video description below. So this is just my go-to vanilla layer cake recipe. These are 7-inch cake rounds, and I'm going to be building the cake on a 10-inch grease-proof cake board. So it's really important that you use a grease-proof cake board because that way if you get any frosting on the edges, it'll come right off with a moist paper towel and it's not going to show any grease stains. So that is step number 1. In addition to that, underneath I have a non-slip mat here. So this came with my cake stand, which is an Ateco 612, but if you don't have one, you can just order some non-slip mats online and cut out a circle and place it underneath your cake board. That is really important because as you're frosting, you don't want it to be sliding around everywhere. So now that we have that in place, I'm going to be frosting it with some of my American buttercream. So I have this in a piping bag just to keep things a little bit more simple. But if you don't want to put it in a piping bag or you don't want to waste the plastic, you can always just leave it in a bowl and use a spatula to scoop it on. I do find though that using a piping bag makes it a lot easier to get the frosting evenly distributed between the layers and around the cake. So if you're not comfortable with that or you haven't done it a lot of times, a piping bag will make the process easier. So in addition to our cake stand, I have 2 tools here that we're going to be using to help get a really nice and even cake. So one is my large offset spatula here, and we're going to use this to spread the frosting evenly between the layers and also to spread the frosting around on our kind of first pass around the cake. The other tool, which is one of my favorites also, is a bench scraper. So this is actually just a general kitchen tool, but it's really big in cake decorating because once you've evenly distributed the frosting around your cake, you get those really beautiful sides to give your cake a really clean finish. So I also have a bowl here, which you're probably like, why? So as I'm decorating and using my spatula and my bench scraper, I'm going to get extra frosting on my tools. And to make the process a little bit cleaner, it's really great to be able to scrape off the excess frosting off of your tools so that they're easier to work with. So those are the tools that we'll be using today. The links will be included below, and you can also go to my Amazon storefront. I have all the links to everything and more there. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in now so you guys can see exactly what I'm doing as I start to assemble this cake. So to start off, I'm going to add just a dab of buttercream onto the center of my cake board, and I'm going to fan it out using my large offset spatula. And this is going to act as kind of the glue that holds our cake layer in place. So I'm going to unwrap my first cake layer here. If you wanted to, you could also trim off the caramelization around the sides, which I sometimes do. But for this cake, I'm actually thinking about frosting it in a semi-naked way, so I wanted to leave on some of it. So you want to make sure the cake layer is really nice and centered because wherever you set this is how the whole cake is going to be built up. So next I'm going to add an even layer of buttercream here. So I'm just going to pipe around, starting on the edge, just working my way in, making some rings. Again, if you are not using a piping bag, I'll show you on our next layer how to do that. So you can see it is pretty level already, but I'm going to use my large offset spatula. I'm just going to spin the cake stand and apply a little bit of pressure, not to scrape the frosting off, but just to continue to smooth it around the cake layer. So you can see I'm removing a little bit of it. I'm going to scrape it in my bowl here. I'm going to do one more pass just to try to get it really nice and level. Great. And if you have any areas where you think like, oh, that might not have enough frosting, no problem in just taking a little bit of the frosting that you scraped off your spatula and adding it. So that looks pretty nice and level. So we're going to move on and add on our next cake layer. So we'll place this right on top. I always like to press down a little bit with my hands just to make sure that the layers are compacted and there's no air trapped in there. If there is air trapped in there, sometimes it can kind of try to escape once the cake is stacked, and that can lead to bulging sides. So I always like to try to avoid that when possible. So next, you guys, I'm going to actually show you I piped some frosting into here. I'm going to dollop it into the center of the cake. So this is what you would do if you were not using a piping bag. It takes a little bit of time to know exactly how much frosting you want between your layers or you like between your layers. So you can always add more or remove some. It's a learning process as you go, and you'll get more comfortable with it over time. So I'm just working this around to the edges from the center. As you can see, there's a light sweeping motion. And again, I'm not applying a lot of pressure, and I'm really working with the frosting to get it to the edges. It's not pulling up any crumbs. And another reason why I'm not getting a ton of crumbs is because my cake layers are frozen. So you can see they're pretty stiff, and they're definitely still cold, and that really helps with the frosting process. So if you have any issues with kind of crumbs coming up in your frosting, or it seems to get really messy, try chilling your cake layers next time, and that will make the process so much easier, I promise. So as you're building your cake layers up, if you want to make sure they're level, you can kind of get down on one knee and use your bench scraper to just kind of press your layers and make sure that they're nice and straight. And that way if things start to slide, you'll notice and you can course correct as you're building up. Another thing that's great about freezing your cake layers is that by doing that, the buttercream between the layers will firm up from the cold temperature, and that will help your layers from sliding as you're decorating. And I think it just makes the whole process a little bit easier. So whenever I'm adding my last cake layer, I like to place it upside down. So I'm going to flip it so the side that baked against the pan is facing up. The reason I like to do this is it makes it easier to frost. It baked against the pan so it's super flat, and the caramelization just makes the whole process a little easier. So now that that's stacked, I'm going to apply a little bit of pressure here with my hands, just to make sure there's no air. If you wanted to, or you have issues with bulging sides, you could always place a piece of parchment paper over this and put a pot or something heavy on it that will help kind of compress the cake and get any air bubbles out. So now that I've pressed down on this, I'm going to add a thin crumb coat around the cake. So this process would be much easier with a piping bag, but I really want to show you guys how to do this just with, frosting that you made in a bowl. I'm going to start to work the frosting around the cake. And again, I'm not applying a lot of pressure because you're not trying to push your layers over. You're really just trying to get the frosting to stick to your cake layers. And if you have any issues where you're trying to add the frosting and it's not sticking, again, my recommendation for that would be to chill your cake layers, because when they're cold, the buttercream will firm up against them due to the temperature, and it really just helps make frosting, assembling and frosting the cake so much easier. So the purpose of the crumb coat is to trap any excess crumbs that might come off as we're doing this in the first layer, and then when we add on our second layer of frosting, it's going to be really smooth and beautiful, and it will be flawless. You want to make sure the entire cake is coated here. We're going to add a little bit of frosting to the top here, and then we're going to smooth with our bench scraper. So I'm, again, not going for a ton of frosting up here, just enough to cover it. Want to make sure it's still nice and level. It's always good to do some sense checks as you're going along and just make sure things are straight. If you wanted to, or you really wanted things to be perfect, you could also use a level, which I have done before for tiered cakes, but I don't think it's really necessary for a cake like this. I'm using my bench scraper now just to spread the frosting, really try to get it as smooth as possible. I know that it looked smooth before, but the more perfect your crumb coat is, the easier time you'll have getting a perfect second coat of frosting. So it's worth taking the extra little bit of effort here and really just trying to get it smooth. I'm going to smooth the top of the frosting. We have a little bit of overhang, and I'm taking my bench scraper and I'm gently dragging it towards the center, and then I'm scraping the excess into my frosting bowl. There's different ways to do this. You could also use your offset spatula for this. It really comes down to preference. I just love using my bench scraper because I always have it in my hand at this point in the process. But some people find they have more control with an offset spatula and prefer that. We have a little bit of frosting around the base of the cake, and I always like to just take the edge of my bench scraper and scrape it away. You could also use a moist paper towel, but I find this way works just as well. So now that our crumb coat is nice and firm to the touch, you can see I can touch it and nothing is coming off here. You could either stop here and go with a semi-naked cake look, or you could add a second layer of frosting. So I'm going to take some very generous scoops of frosting here. I like to start at the top and work my way down. So using the same kind of pattern as before when we were spreading, I'm just going to gently work it to the edges of the cake. And then I'm going to do a nice little spin to get it nice and level. So as you can see, we're adding a lot of frosting this time, and it makes it much easier to smooth. So we've got kind of a nice, beautiful little overhang here, and I'm going to use that frosting that I just scraped off to start to work around the cake. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to continue to go back into my bowl, get a little bit more frosting, until the entire cake is covered. And once you kind of get it around the top, you can slowly start to work it down to the bottom, like I'm doing here. So I'm going to do some quick spins and just hold my offset spatula perpendicular to my cake board and try to get this smoothed out at first with my offset spatula, and then you're going to use the same technique as before by placing your bench scraper perpendicular against your cake board and just making some passes around the cake. Again, not a lot of pressure, just very gentle, just kind of guiding the frosting along the cake. Now that our sides are nice and smooth, I'm gonna do one more drag of those edges towards the center of the cake. My last tip to you guys is if you have any bits where it's not quite as smooth as you want it to be, a really quick fix is to run your bench scraper under some really hot water. Be sure to thoroughly dry it, get all that water off there, and then just do a few more passes around your cake. The heat from your bench scraper will help you to kind of scrape away any bits of frosting that are not as smooth as the rest, and will really help give you a clean and finished look. So that is it. We have stacked, filled, crumb coated, and frosted this cake. If you guys are having any issues with any part of this process, please leave them in the comment section below and I'll try to get back to you so we can get you on the right track. Well, thanks so much for watching today. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Please let me know if there are any other kind of basic tutorials that you guys would like to see, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon. See you later.